really important to realize, like, we're not just talking about a colloquialism of, like, I'm being kind of narcissistic. It doesn't just mean selfish or self-centered. And we can throw that term around a lot. I'm acting really narcissistic right now. I'm just thinking about myself. Narcissism does not equal selfishness. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Being Human podcast. I'm excited to dive deeper with you today again into another issue of mental health, specific issue during this time of mental health awareness. And again, it's not just important 1 month of the year, it's important all the time that we have awareness of these issues and how they affect us in our life and those we love and are in relationship with. So today we're going to dig into narcissism, and more specifically, Narcissistic Personality Disorder. And before we get started, a couple of disclaimers again. This is not meant to be therapy. This is not meant to diagnose anybody with any kind of actual disorder. But these are concepts and issues that are worth talking about and having awareness of, and maybe getting a little bit of insight into how we deal with these kinds of things as they come up in the work that we do. And so it's important to know also, when we're talking about personality disorders, that's a term that might be thrown around a bit. There is a diagnosis that includes that language, and then there's also characteristics that can look like symptoms of a personality disorder. And there's a really important difference between that. You can have characteristics. We all have certain characteristics that line up with what may be a diagnosis of a personality disorder in somebody else, just like all the other disorders. And so it requires clinical expertise and training and a certain level of skill to make that distinction. So that's why I make that little disclaimer point. It's not just a legality. It's really important we understand that just because we talk about these symptoms, these kinds of characteristics or experiences that people have in life, in their own life or in relationships with others, doesn't mean there's an actual diagnosis. So I just want to put that out there. And if there's any question or any fear or any sort of idea that maybe there's something more to look into, of course, reach out. That's what we're here for. So you can always reach out to us. Our website is CatholicPsych.com. There's a contact page there. And so, feel free if you feel like you want to reach out to get some more help or to find out maybe if there is possibly the presence of a diagnosis, that some things of these things are resonating with you, then certainly please do reach out. But anyways, back to the topic for today. We're going to talk about narcissism. And this especially is a topic that I think is important to look at from both angles. There's people who are dealing with these symptoms and characteristics within themselves, and there's a lot of people who feel like others in their life are acting from a place of narcissism. And, I want to say too, especially with narcissism, it's really important to realize, like, we're not just talking about a colloquialism of, like, I'm being kind of narcissistic. It doesn't just mean selfish or self-centered. And we can throw that term around a lot. I'm acting really narcissistic right now. I'm just thinking about myself. Narcissism does not equal selfishness. We all suffer from that kind of narcissism when we use it in place of selfishness. I'm battling my own selfishness every day. So I could say that I'm acting a little narcissistic every day. But what we're talking about today is obviously much deeper. And so as we look at this, I'm going to talk about it from the clinical perspective of, like, what would go into the diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder. Also understanding that there could be people with certain experiences that are related to this. So there's a bit of a spectrum here. Not everybody's all the way at the full diagnosis, and we're not just talking about basic selfishness. We're talking about sort of probably a lot of where people fall in the middle. But to kind of define this as a disorder and, like, what people with this disorder are actually experiencing, I think it's really this terror. It's terror of insignificance. It's a sense of just not mattering at all. And that's at the root of it, of what this kind of life is like. And there really are two forms of narcissistic personality disorder, or two forms of narcissism that are present. And there's sort of two extreme expressions of the same core reality. So it's that terror of insignificance that's really at the heart of everything. But it can be expressed in a way of being sort of an inferiority or a superiority. And we'll find that there's different manifestations along the way for different people, and even within people, we can have both, fluctuations of both. The thing that brings them together, though, is this terror of not mattering, and neither of the expressions has a sense of being good enough. It's like there's never enough. It's either too much or it's nothing. And that's really where we're wavering between these two extremes. And both have this sense of inferiority really at the deepest heart of it. So even those who are acting really superior will always be afraid of being found out for actually not being good enough. So where does this come from? There's a couple of theories out there, but there's basically, looking at it in terms of nature and sort of predispositions, genetic or biological. There's some theory out there that say that there are people who are more sensitive than normal to non-verbalized emotional messages. And so we could end up with a hypersensitivity to non-verbalized emotional messages, things that are read between the lines. And we all have experiences of sort of knowing what we should say, what we're supposed to say, and then maybe hopefully saying what we're supposed to say, but maybe feeling other feelings in between those verbalized messages. Well, some people are really quick to pick up on those nonverbal cues, and so they might sense the sort of distortion between what you're feeling and what you're saying. And so some people are born with a greater sensitivity to this. And then you add that in with a family structure where there's a parent who is either idealizing or devaluing the child. And so we kind of sort of group this together to say that children who are either shamed, spoiled, or treated like the special child on a really extreme level. So if you bring those two things together, that greater sensitivity to the nonverbal messages, and then one of these situations where you have a lot of extreme shaming, a lot of extreme spoiling, or a lot of extreme emphasis on how special my child is, that's what could give rise to a lot of these characteristics that we see in this disorder. So the problem here is that those messages of either deeply being shamed or deeply being idealized become what we say is internalized. And so the message from mom or dad becomes the message inside of us. And that voice becomes sort of what we hear internally. And this is sort of part of normal psychology for everybody. But when you have those, again, that mix of that hypersensitivity and then this extreme message that's being given throughout childhood of either being idealized or devalued, that's where we end up with the sort of perfect storm of what's happening here. And so those are the two basic dispositions that give rise to either the inferiority or the superiority. So the child who's very deeply shamed and is picking up on all those emotional cues and then internalizing those messages is then constantly deeply, deeply shaming themselves. And the child who's idealized and raised up it becomes almost like a poster child, or in some of the literature, they say, an appendage to the parent, really fulfilling the parent's own needs. Maybe the parent's own narcissism, or a lot of times with other things like schizophrenia or parental difficulties that are sort of trickling down and then manifesting in that relational dynamic from parent to child. The child is built up, but not in a way that's really with the child, not in a way that really recognizes the child. So what happens is that voice of idealization becomes internalized, and then that child is going to grow up with this grandiosity, and everything has to be the best. And again, remember, there's still that fear of inferiority. So anytime that there's a sense that somebody else has the best, there's going to be envy. So a lot of these deep emotions are happening here. And why does this make it so difficult for a relationship? This is a deep sense of everybody else around me simply manifesting all of the self-criticism that I have within myself. That's the person suffering with narcissistic personality disorder. And so that person almost can't be aware of other people as other people. Somebody with real NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is unaware of the needs of other people. And this is really hard to be in a relationship with, because you don't exist. If you're in a relationship with somebody else who has NPD, you don't exist as a person in their life. And if you're trying to relate to them, it can be incredibly dehumanizing. And we don't always know that that's what's happening. So we're struggling to sort of be present and to show up and to have a voice and matter to this other person. And we have all the ways that we are dealing with that sense of being dehumanized. And we're reacting. Maybe if I explain it differently, maybe if I try harder, maybe if I come down with more force, maybe if I submit and give in and sort of try to really soft pedal and soft shoe it and be really loving and attentive and forgiving. And, we're always trying to navigate, try this, try that. Maybe this will work. Maybe that'll work, so that I can actually be in relationship with this person. At the end of the day, when it's an actual diagnosis, it's not going to work, because anything you're doing in all of those different modes, none of it is going to show up as you being a different person. All of those efforts are actually being received by the person with NPD as a manifestation of their own internal world. All the different parts that make up that person's internal world, they can't actually see you as different from. And so, if you try to show up there and say hey, I matter too, that's going to be taken as deep criticism. And if you first try to show up really sort of loving and accommodating, and I'm going to be sort of submissive to what you need. If you need to be built up, I'm going to build you up. If you need me to validate you, I'm going to validate you. You're coming in as the person that's been internalized as sort of that idealization. It's not actually you're a different person that's being seen as a different person doing the work, putting in the effort, and making that effort. It's not going to count. You're not earning points. It's not ever going to register that somehow you are actually making an effort in this relationship, because you can't even exist as a separate person to start with. Whatever you're doing, you just happen to be fitting in with one of these parts that is being experienced internally. And so, these people are really suffering, again, from this, remember, it's this terror of insignificance. And because of that, and the way that they're navigating internally this deep, deep, deep fear that I don't matter, they're only going to be looking at everybody else in those terms. So they can't actually explore relationships. They can't actually value other people or see other people or understand where other people are coming from. Empathy is not possible. That's one of the hallmarks of the sort of clinical diagnosis. But that just is obvious, because the other person can't even be seen no matter what. So somebody with NPD can't put themselves into somebody else's shoes, because other people almost don't exist in this world of deep terror. And the really, really sad thing about it is that people suffering with this have such a deep need for others. They need others. And sometimes we could even see that and have deep compassion because we see how much they need others, but their capacity to love others is actually very, very shallow, if at all existent. Because that idea of real love, actual love, which is to step out of oneself, to put oneself in somebody else's shoes, to die to self for somebody else, they just can't do it. They're not at a place of self-ownership and safety and security enough to be able to step out. And so this is why somebody with NPD can't express an apology. And it actually, interestingly enough, they can't express apology, nor can they express gratitude. Because if you think about it, again, from this dual lens of inferiority, superiority, both an apology and an expression of gratitude require a sort of deeper sense. They're built on the premise that something's missing from me. And they don't want to admit that. That's their deepest fear. So to say sorry means like I did something wrong. To be grateful for receiving something is to say I didn't have it before. So their deepest fear, again, coming to life, like I was missing something before. I was wrong before. I was flawed before. I was imperfect and unfulfilled before. And I don't want anybody to know that secret. So that's why both an apology and an expression of gratitude, like real, true, deep gratitude, is incredibly difficult for somebody in this kind of state to express. And so, what happens here? I mean, a lot of the personality disorders are really tough to have self-awareness of earlier on in life. And there's usually a lot of turmoil, a lot of just relational catastrophe. And even, especially when people come to therapy for these kinds of symptoms, they're not necessarily coming in because they believe that they have narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. But whatever reason they're coming into therapy, what ends up happening is it's an idealistic fantasy of therapy. And so the therapist is almost sort of just like another way to be the best, to have the best. A lot of times they're seeking out the best therapist or the best reputation of somebody or the most famous something or somebody who wrote a book or somebody who, has like something that fits into that paradigm. And, as a therapist, and we are trained in this, one thing that's really difficult is obviously we want to get into the heart of relationship like very quickly. And usually somebody with an actual diagnosis for NPD is not interested at all in really reflecting on and getting into the relationship. And so we experience the same thing that other people who are close in their life experience, which is if you want to show up and be like really present with this person, that's going to be taken as an attack on their own needs. And they're going to be really defensive against something like that. And so, as therapists, we learn how to tolerate being dehumanized. That's part of what we have to do. And I think it's good in this case, especially for those who are in relationship with people with NPD. Sometimes you think like, if I could only just love more, that's going to help this person. But you have to understand what that really requires, because that is what we're here for. And that's why people with these significant levels of these kinds of experiences really should get professional help, because we have to sit with and tolerate being dehumanized. But it's within the boundaries of the context of our relationship, which is a professional one. So we're not tolerating being dehumanized in our personal lives, in our personal relationships. We're doing it professionally, and that's what we're trained to do. And even then, it's really difficult. It's really difficult. It's sometimes some of the hardest work is to just sit with and give so much to a relationship and be sort of repeatedly attacked and dehumanized in that relational dynamic, and still be able to sit with that, still be able to tolerate that, still offer the safe place to return empathy and to return a sense of goodness and be able to allow clients to explore, what that is like for them, and eventually, slowly, little by little, build up enough of a solid base, a secure base of a relationship where they might be able to tolerate the tiniest little bit of self-reflection or relational reflection that sort of starts to move the needle away from, their defenses. That should never be expected in a personal relationship. And that's what ends up happening as we get pulled into these relationships where it's like, if only I could just love a little bit more, try a little bit harder, stay a little bit longer, then it'll work. Now, that's not to say, I'm not commenting at all here on like marriage and the vow of marriage and whether you should leave or anything like that. That's not what I mean by stay. What I mean by stay is like emotionally staying in this dynamic. So a lot of times, especially in a vow of marriage, for the sake of the other, it requires putting up a bit of a wall and not being dehumanized and letting the consequences fall where they may, even if it means that, there's going to be a real rift or rupture in the relationship. But it's not your fault for putting an end to being dehumanized. This is part of what makes this so difficult. And that's why a lot of times we encourage people who are suffering with others who have NPD to also seek out help, because this takes a lot of shoring up, a lot of support, a lot of backup, a lot of sort of encouragement. Like, yes, you're still doing the right thing. Don't go back to the enabling. Don't go back to that place. It's not going to work. And, this is a really difficult process. But at the end of the day, we're all made for communion, and we're all made for love out of love. So no matter how deep the flaws are, no matter how deep the wounds are, no matter how deep the imperfections are, there's always a possibility for hope and restoration. And so the deep shame that people feel from these parts that have been internalized from external, those parts are not the reality of the person. There's a part inside that's been internalized that is the voice of shame. There's a part from outside that's been internalized, which is this emotion of envy and fear of being found out. There's a part that's been internalized of grandiosity, and I'm the best, and I have to have the best, and my value comes from being the best and putting everybody else down. But these are parts. These are not the whole, and these are not the true self. So no matter how destructive or disorienting or disordered the part might seem to be, there's always more to the story. Getting to that part might require some extra help, but it is very possible. It's always possible. One last point that I want to put on here too is like there's a lot of perfectionistic tendencies that might come up along the way. So along with the shame, along with the envy, along with the grandiosity, this perfectionism also becomes internalized. And so a lot of times people with these characteristics hold themselves to these perfectionistic, unrealistic ideals. And it's, again, through that dual lens, it's either they're convinced that they've attained the ideals, and then they're going to sort of like hold everybody else up to those expectations and put them down when they fail, or they're just constantly feeling like they'll never reach these ideals, so they feel infinitely flawed and hopeless that they could ever be good enough. And so, again, those are different parts. That's not the true self. But as we start to break these things down, it's definitely possible to get back to this center, this place where the self really can exist. And I think if you're dealing with people in your life, whether it's family, whether it's work related, a lot of times these things show up in hierarchical relationships. I hate to say it, but a lot of times working within church structures, or a lot of times religion, spirituality gets mixed because of that perfectionism and those ideals. So a lot of times, within religious structures, there's a lot of this stuff that comes out because, people set out these ideals, and there's a lot that's consistent with our humanity and what God calls us to in terms of living the life of perfection, of seeking the ideals of holiness. And so a lot of this can become conflated and confused really easily. But in all of these cases, it's really helpful if we could take that step back and realize that there's a lot more to the story here, whether it's somebody in your family, whether it's somebody in your work or your community or whatever it is. The first thing is to understand with compassion. And if anybody out there is dealing with things internally that this is kind of resonating with, self-compassion. Having that compassion with yourself, understanding this is a wound, and it's a wound of terror, a terror of insignificance, and that the truth is the reality of your real identity, who you're actually created to be, who these other people are actually created to be, made in the image of God, completely, totally, infinitely loved, valued, and given reverence by God. That God loves us so deeply, he reverences our unique individual identity and our unrepeatable dignity. So this is where we can rest if we can get to that place, whether it's something for yourself or somebody else that you know. Starting off with that position can be really helpful, because whether we're dealing with this in ourselves or others, those voices of criticism are terrifying, and we can feel incredibly beat up. They're really bullying voices, and we can be really bullied and beat up by these voices. So to understand that there's more to the story behind there is a good foundation to begin with. All right, so once again, I hope this has blessed you. If this has pulled anything out for you or triggered anything for you or brought anything up for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can get more from us at CatholicPsych.com. You can learn more about our model of mentorship, which we're using to help people walk through these issues with either themselves or other people that they're learning how to be in relationship with. Our new model you can learn about at CatholicPsych.com/townhall. Otherwise, please give us your feedback, leave a review for us on the podcast, and I look forward to sharing more with you. God bless you.